Hello, and welcome to a conversation about Monkey Beach, directed by Loretta Todd. The film is now streaming on Crave in Canada. No matter where you're joining us from, we always encourage you to reflect on the land that you're on, who the traditional keepers of the land are, what the treaty relationship is, or if it's unceded territory. Here in Toronto, I'm currently located on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee. The territory is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. It is home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And we at TIFF are grateful to be working on this land. I'm Cameron Bailey. I'm the artistic director and co-head here at TIFF. Before we dive in, I'd also like to thank our lead sponsor, Bell, and our major sponsors, RBC, L'Oreal Paris, and Visa, as well as our major supporters, the Government of Canada, the Government of Ontario, and the City of Toronto for their continued support. I'm joined today by writer-director Loretta Todd to talk about her feature film, Monkey Beach, based on Eden Robinson's best-selling novel. It's set in Kitimat Village, British Columbia, within the Haisla Nation on Canada's west coast. The film follows a young woman who realizes that she's meant to save her brother from a tragic fate that she's foreseen since childhood. It's a captivating allegory about learning to coexist with both the ghosts that haunt us and the spirits who might enlighten us. The film stars Grace Dove, Nathaniel Arcon, Joel Willett, Glenn Gould, Adam Beach, and Tina Lammerman, among others. It just swept the awards at the most recent American Indian Film Festival in San Francisco. Loretta Todd has really made this story from Eden Robinson her own. Her credits include award-winning documentaries such as Forgotten Warriors, The People Go On, and Hands of History, made with the National Film Board of Canada. She created, produced, and directed Tansi, Nehiyawetan, a Cree language children's series on APTN, the Aboriginal People's Television Network, and she created My Cree, which is a Cree language learning app. And she's currently in production on season 3 of Coyote's Crazy Smart Science, which is an award-winning children's series that teaches science through an Indigenous perspective. Loretta, thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, Tansi. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Loretta, it's been a long time. We first met, I think it's like 30 years ago, believe it or not, when you were making documentaries and we were both trying to make some change within the Canadian film landscape. Before we get to Monkey Beach, could you talk a little bit about what brought you to the path of filmmaking and what those earlier films from years ago have taught you as well?
Well, first of all, just to do a bit of my protocols, I'd like to thank the grandmothers and grandfathers for protecting us and guiding us as we tell stories, and also to acknowledge the Squamish Nation and where I live in Gibsons, BC. I shouldn't be making films. I ran away from home when I was 13. I lived on the street. I slept in grain sheds along the highway. I slept in Stanley Park. I, did things that just to survive. So who knows? I think the blessing was that I became a very young teenage mother. And when it looked like social welfare was going to try to take her away, I said, never. And so I kind of moved into another world where I worked and did anything where I wouldn't have to rely on the state. And I think that kind of changed my life. So it led to me to places like the Vancouver Friendship Center, where I was, welcomed by wonderful people like the late Glenn George. And so it kind of changed my life. It allowed me to kind of go into, albeit West Coast culture, but very much urban Native culture here on the West Coast. And it allowed me to become part of something and to put myself in service to the Indigenous community here. And then that eventually led to me becoming a filmmaker, because to me it was another way of being in service. I was living in other people's territories. My family is originally from Alberta. We're from the St. Paul de Métis, which is not there anymore, but it was sort of historic first time Métis attempt at a reservation. Also from Whitefish Lake First Nations, and also from the Turtle Mountain Chippewa. And then we're also one of the first Métis families from Winnipeg. So I had grown up in this sort of both rural and urban environment within Alberta, and we had Indigenous experience and Indigenous knowledge, but leaving home so early kind of led me like I say, to the coast, and I was there in this territory of this coastal people, and I knew that I had to find a way to be in service. So it's not my territory, so how can I be in service? And I did that through volunteering, working for Native organizations, wherever I could help. And it seemed to me at some point there was this kind of inner filmmaker trying to come out, and someone who needed to tell stories. So eventually I went to film school at Simon Fraser, and it was a way of being behind the camera, allowing my story and my storytelling and my artistry to come through, and yet to be in service to the people.
Mm-hmm. You've mentioned that idea of being in service, and I wonder, apart from just being in someone else's territory, what was there within you that actually made that an instinct of yours, something that you wanted to pursue in your work?
I think it's kind of, I think there's a kind of a combination. There was, unfortunately, sometimes that Catholicism, those nuns kind of got in your head, and it's like, oh, you got it, So there's a bit of that, and as problematic as all of the colonization that comes with the church, and and I respect people who still follow it, but it's not part of my life anymore. But the other part was that, as much as our family may have been disjointed, being urban natives, there was still a part I saw very clearly in especially my dad, was this idea that you're no better or no worse than anybody. You're there to bring good to the world. He struggled. He was an alcoholic, and that was always a problem, and up and down. But when he was not drinking, when he was his authentic self, that's who he was. He was a person who wanted to, give to others, and again, and so that was always important. And then also my mother was the same way. I mean, she was the first person, if there was an immigrant family that moved in where we were living, she was the first to go knock on the door and say, hey, hi, welcome, here's some food. Where everybody else was saying, oh no, we can't, don't welcome them, and didn't matter where they were from, didn't matter. Mm-hmm. So I always saw this kind of kindness. I had a interesting grandmother who was not that kind. She was a real rabble-riser who liked to do lots of things that were, I wish she would, on my reflection now, I see how tough she was. But I had a very kind grandfather. And so I saw again that kindness and also fierceness. Both of them were fierce. They would stand up and do anything for their family. So I think those were things that were kind of ingrained in me and became part of who I am and the work that I do.
Mm-hmm. Loretta, you started out making all of these incredible documentaries. That's where we first met. We showed Hands of History in the early 90s, and you're now moving more into fiction. But I know this story, Monkey Beach, has been with you for years and years, and you optioned it for the screen about 10 years ago, from what I understand. What was it that first drew you to Eden Robinson's story?
Well, there's the kind of practical thing, and that was that someone said you should option Monkey Beach because Eden's writing is like your filmmaking. And of course, when I read the book, yes, it was. It's very elliptical, very lyrical, very, not linear. None of my work has really been that linear, which has been sometimes not always worked for me, So in terms of the world, but in any case, it's the way I tell stories. Maybe it's because I didn't really know how to make a documentary. I went to an experimental film school, so I made what way to tell a story I felt was real to me. But in any case, I think it's when I read the character Eden, Lisa, because Lisa is so many. She sort of embodies, Indigenous woman, on the verge of embracing their medicine. So here we are as Indigenous women, we're told by the world that, we don't have power, that we are victims, that, we are meant to suffer, that we are basically kind of held up as sort of like victims of colonial power and authority, that somehow, we're sacrificed all the time by that white colonial authority. Somehow it seems justified. They find all kinds of ways to justify our pain and suffering. So here was a woman who was on the verge of embracing that medicine, a medicine that, you know, culturally, philosophically, within our cultures, that would happen. That would be part of our process. That would be part of who we are, how we, you know, we came of age, how we would, you know, recognize, you know, what powers we had, what you know, what we had, gifts we had to give back to our community. So here was this woman who was on the verge of that. And to me, it's something that speaks to me as an Indigenous woman who, you know, who's had to struggle and has always had to be, you know, in a way, not, you know, not believing I have power, not believing I have medicine. So it was a chance for me to really go deep into that story and deep into that experience. And I think that's what really attracted me to it.
Mm-hmm.
And also this idea of being kind of in this place of sort of vulnerability. I mean, I think giving my life history, you know, being a runaway, all these things. So this idea of living in a state of vulnerability, how do we go beyond that? And so that was something that was really sort of really important and critical to me. And yeah, you know, I love the family. I mean, I think for me, this idea of trying to the strength of Indigenous families is also often undermined and not recognized, and sort of, you know, that's one of another part of colonial power is to sort of destroy our families. So it was so interesting to see. And for me, it just sort of the love that Lisa had for her family, the love that all the family had for one another, as disjointed as they are, it still was really critical to me to try to embrace that and portray that.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like the character of Lisa resonated with you personally in a number of ways, and the casting must have been especially important in finding the right actor to play Lisa, and you found Grace Duff, who is terrific in the film. It's a very emotive, grounded, kind of deep performance. What did you want from the actor who would end up playing Lisa? What were you looking for?
What was I looking for? Well, you know, it took a long time to make the film. So I was looking at various, you know, great Lisas over time, and there was any number of Indigenous women actors out there who I love, and you know, would have been happy to have worked with, had the money, had I been able to put the deal together, had, you know, all those things came together earlier to be able to make the film. But you know, I'm usually a little ahead of, you know, the curve, if you like. So, so I mean, when I met Grace, there was something about her. She's interesting because in many ways she's already embraced that medicine. She already knows her medicine. She has this, you know, she's worked really hard on that. She's been in service to her community and to particularly Indigenous youth for a long time. And also the fact that, you know, it's not been easy. It's not like, you know, things were handed to her. Here you go. Now you're famous. So there was something that kind of also I felt. So it was like, okay, you know, you know, there was no one there trying to make me a star. So I'm going to try to make her a star. So, I mean, it's so I kind of felt, I even said that to her the first day. I said, you know what? You don't have to be in competition with me in any way. I'm here to serve you. I'm here to make you a star. And so, and I think that was one of the things. And there was kind of a subtlety. She has a very good command of the kind of the physicality of acting, but in a very subtle way. And so that was something that I need. I've always watched that, you know, even though I've been doing a lot of documentaries, I've also been, that was my original intention, to do kind of experimental features, if you like. And when I think about that, when I watch actors, when I audition actors, I always think about their comfort level in their bodies. Like, how do they hold themselves? How do they move in space? And
how can you tell, Loretta, how can you tell how comfortable an actor is in their body? What are you looking for?
I actually, that's funny, because I remember this back in the day. It's not the first time I tried to make a feature. Back in the day, we were trying to make different features. Evan Adams asked me to direct a script he had, you know, there was a Rougarou Métis script that we tried to, you know, make back in the day. I had my Paris scripts. And so, you know, I was doing auditions here and there because we thought we were going to have those breakthroughs before. But so one time I had auditions and I was having them not just lead the lines, I was having them do physical acts. And some actors going, "Oh, that's strange. Why would you, like, why? That's an unusual audition." And I said, "Well, because I want to see how you move in space. Like, how is your body language? How is you?" And it's interesting. there's two sides to that, you know. There's kind of like when you go into when you're around orators, when you're around, and I'm lucky enough to have worked with in Native organizations where there was I heard some of the great orators who are gone now, but I was young enough and they were old enough where I was seeing people in their 80s and 90s who were speaking, who, you know, had themselves been raised by great orators. And when you watch great orators, it's not just the words, it's their physicality, it's their eyes, it's just how they hold themselves. It's because, you know, words have power, words, you know, words are, it's energy. And so I was, you know, so there's that. I was very conscious of that. You know, again, having to being able to be welcome into, you know, the Longhouse, into, you know, into various ceremonies over the, you know, time. And so I'd seen that. And I see that power of the oral tradition. Oral tradition isn't just because we couldn't write words down on paper. It's because we have this, you know, philosophical belief in the power of words. And that comes in more than just the word itself. It comes in how the word is thrown. You know, I tell a story, I don't know if we have enough time, but I tell a story about when I made the biography of the late Chief Dan George, and the young girl who acted with him. She said that Dan had slow eyes, and she said he would look really, really slow at something. And she said she would look back at the crew and the producers and the directors, and they were all looking at where Dan was looking. And she said that was a real lesson for her. She later became chief and a lawyer in her life. And that was something that stayed with her in terms of that kind of power of the orator. And then so there's that. And then interestingly enough, I was lucky enough, lived in New York for about a year on a fellowship to NYU. And while I was there, I met an Indigenous man who was studying at the actor studio. And so he arranged for me to go watch his classes at the actor studio. And I watched how from the beginning, because he was just first year, they do all these physical things where they learn to be a bear, be a cop or whatever, all these kind of ideas. So they're kind of embedding their acting performance with this sort of sense memory. And interestingly enough, when I did the biography of the late Chief Dan George, I met Arthur Penn, and we talked about that. And we talked about how oratory and actor studio technique, there's storytelling, there's very similar parallels. So, I mean, I like to think that it comes partly from my own training. So my own sort of education as an Indigenous storyteller that, you know, has at least had some glimpse, have some opportunity to be around those old style storytellers, be around in those sort of those sort of important moments, you know, and so that's kind of, you know, something that I look for, that maybe intuitively I look for. But again, it comes hopefully from some kind of training I've received. So in Grace, I just saw that she embodied that. I mean, you know, she could say something with, you know, just the most subtle of movements, you know, she can convey so much. And I find out, and then it was something, what was really exciting for me is being able to give the space to the actors themselves to do that as well. One of the things
you also have, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, no, go ahead. I'll take some
I was going to ask about another of your actors, Adam Beach, who has, you know, deep roots in his community in Winnipeg, but he's also spent some time in Hollywood and has, you know, that kind of training and that kind of experience as well. What did he bring to the project as a whole, and to just embodying Uncle Mick in the movie?
Well, you know, what I really liked was one of the things I say, and actually I learned this when I went to film school at Sam Fraser. I didn't hear, this was before my time, I didn't get to actually attend this person's class, but Jean-Pierre Lefebvre came to Simon Fraser at some point, and apparently he told the students that when he creates a film, whether it's a documentary or feature film, he creates what he called, maybe I've used this word over the years, but the word I use is sacred space. So he creates this circle around the story and around the people who telling that story, whether it's people from a documentary or the actors in the feature film. So he creates this sort of sacred space, and he has his own protocols in order to sort of achieve that. So what I tried to do with the making of Monkey Beach is kind of create that space. So sometimes it was the bigger space of the actual making of the film. Sometimes it was just within a scene. And so when Adam is in that scene, that residential school around the campfire scene, which he's an amazing actor, and he's shown it by the fact that he's acted with Clint Eastwood and all these great actors, and his career survives and continues to thrive. But I really like to think that particular scene, he was in some of his most authentic performance I've seen, and I think it's because I created that moment so that they could be they could be completely truthful. They could be completely no false moment. And I'd like to think I give that safety. I think that's one of the jobs of a director, is to give that safety, give that sense of protection to the cast and crew, that is that they can go where they need to go in order to tell this story. And so I feel that that's something that Adam understood, maybe sort of instinctively just as someone, a very seasoned filmmaker, actor, that he understood that I was giving him that space. And just being respectful, not being afraid. I think it's the other thing. I think sometimes non-Indigenous directors are sometimes afraid to sort of give direction to Indigenous actors. And I also think that I was told by another actor, not Adam, but I was told by another actor, he said often directors treat them like puppets. And so they really valued the fact that I was treating them like actors, and that people who had craft, who had storytelling ability and had experienced that to bring to that moment. So I'm really proud of the fact that they all went to that place, so that there's not a false moment in any of their performances.
In thinking about the sacred space you're creating around the story, around certain moments within the telling of the story, I'm also wondering about the setting. You chose to shoot in Kitimat, not a simple place to shoot a fairly big movie. From what I understand, you've got to bring just about everything in terms of all the gear. Can you talk a little bit about why it was important to shoot in that location?
Well, that was always my dream from the beginning. I started making this film originally with Jeff Bear, who is a amazing Mi'kmaq filmmaker in his own right. We parted, eventually amicably, but that was both our dreams. We both, both believe that it should come from the place. The story, storytelling and Indigenous culture, place is very critical to storytelling. So that was always a dream. That was always a vision, to film it in Kitimat. And I actually ran into a lot of obstacles because of that, because people would say, "Oh, that's crazy. You can't go film there. It's too expensive." Like Kitimat, a drive, just a normal drive with a car, not a truck full of stuff, is 18 hours. So, so it's a long way, and you can fly some stuff in, and then there's a ferry that comes up, as well to get to Prince Rupert, and then you can drive in, but still it's not easy. It's a long journey, but I was determined. And, admittedly, we did go and do scouting in and around Vancouver early on, just in case, I could have probably got a lower budget at an earlier time and made the film using, up from Vancouver up towards Squamish. There's some sort of similarities to the water and in the mountains around there to Kitimat, but it just didn't feel right. It would feel like, and I know that, filmmaking, people go, "Oh, well, how many, some of the great films weren't made in the places where the story is told. So it's not like there's some special magic, that I would, that somehow, I was sort of thinking, but I just really felt that it had to be there. I also felt that I tried to do my business with redistribution of wealth. So I tried to live that value so that, what little, I could bring to the community, I would hope that it could flow back to the community. So we, hired as many people, that way I could charter the boats, lots of boats, in Monkey Beach. I could, hire a lot of people from there, the people who, provided the food, provided the craft services, all those things that could, be redistributed into the community rather than in Vancouver, where there's so much service work anyways. No one's hurting for service work in Vancouver. Right. So that was really critical. And also, it was just something. And I also felt, again, the story does come from place. And if
it pays off, though, it's so It's so beautifully shot. It's so evocative. And, movies are make-believe often. And Casablanca wasn't shot in Casablanca, obviously. Chicago was shot in Toronto. There's all kinds of, iconic movies that weren't shot in the places they're set. But I think that Monkey Beach does gain something really powerful from the effort you took to shoot it there. There are these really haunting images that come up as a result. And I wanted to ask you about, you talked a little bit earlier about your approach to storytelling being more elliptical, not a kind of conventional, straightforward narrative. And there is fantasy and realism woven together. There is that sense of ellipsis sometimes in your film, but you also approach very traumatic material, events that happen in Lisa's world and in her life in a very particular way. Where I think you somehow are able to convey the pain of that trauma without exploiting it in any way. And I guess I wanted to ask about your narrative approach to the most difficult material in Monkey Beach.
Well, part of it comes from the script, so this script writing took a long time, because every time we go back to telefilm and say, oh, you're almost there, and bless their hearts. I mean, we worked with, it wouldn't be here without telephone. So, all my respect and, appreciation. So, but at the same time, it was, frustrating because it was like, oh, okay. Sometimes the scripts were much more elliptical, there was much more experimentation. They were longer. That was one of their biggest complaints. It's too long, Loretta. You can't afford to make this film. You're not going to raise the budget to make the film this long. So there was all these different kind of barriers, if you like. But when you read the book, there's trauma pervades the book, but it's never explicit. It's never like, in graphic detail. It's always this kind of, it's under your skin. It's something, it's almost like something that pervades our lives every day, especially as Indigenous women. There's always that sense of danger. We don't have to, and we've seen it. It's been so exploited. There's so much graphic detail of and women in general, rape and murder and so on. And it's not to say that those can't be shown in their graphic detail and just to kind of, and some people can do that. Some people can do that and do it in a respectful way. But I felt for me, I had to do it in a way that was sort of respectful of that experience, that the people who have gone through that experience own that moment. They own what they have experienced, and those characters own those moments. And those characters I have to know so well to know how do they want those moments to be revealed to the world. Just like if I was making a documentary, I would, how would I want those moments to be revealed to the world? I remember making educational videos a while ago about HIV/AIDS, and I was told by the commissioner of those videos that they wanted the most emaciated, bodies, shown. And I said, well, I will ask the people who have those bodies, how do they want their body shown? And the ones who were in that particular video didn't want their body shown in that way. So to me, it always comes down to the kind of sovereignty of the person in the documentary, but also the sovereignty of the character. And so to me, the sovereignty of the character was telling me that they didn't want that a graphic, painful, in your face kind of, dripping with what's the word, voyeurism. In the telling of their story. They wanted to own that story. So in the case of Karaoke, she owns that moment when she reveals. And to me, that was really critical. It speaks again to, Indigenous women embracing the medicine, Indigenous women being sovereign beings who have that choice. And that was sort of like critical to me, not just in terms of the storytelling, but also, as an Indigenous woman, looking toward that, me being in service to my community and being able to, recognize the sovereignty of each and every one of us and each and every one of our stories.
Mm-hmm. The last thing I want to ask is about that idea of sovereignty. You talk about it in terms of the characters within the story and owning those particular moments. But the idea of narrative sovereignty is a larger one that has come up when it comes to stories that involve Indigenous characters, Indigenous people at all, and the idea that we need to think about stories the way that we have been encouraged, finally, to think about land, that it has a history, caretakers, people who are responsible for that land or that story, and that those owners are the ones that need to have the most agency when they're being represented. And in light of Monkey Beach and your telling of this story, how are you thinking about what narrative sovereignty means now?
Well, first of all, I think that there's, so many stories. There's no single storyteller. There's no single story, that there's, multitudes of stories, multitude of experiences. If we think of Indigenous culture as this idea of that, it's energy, making coyote science, it's very influenced by people like Dr. Leroy Littlebear, his partner Amethyst, first writer, and they talk a lot about energy. It's all energy. So what is the energy that's sort of contained within the sovereignty of that story? And how am I supposed to honor that sovereignty, but also that energy? Like what's its purpose? What's it here to serve? What's it bringing into the world? And how can I, best portray that? So, I have to think those very deep philosophical thoughts. It sounds like sort of like a bad, comedy routine. I have to think those big philosophical thoughts, but I do, and I do. I mean, I think of as a storyteller as a kind of you are more than just a storyteller. You are, you're a scientist. You do medicine. You're doing philosophy. You're doing all these things, and you're also thinking about that young Indigenous woman, that girl. Who has, is looking at, who is she? And how is the world portraying her back? What does it say to her about her possibilities, her potential? I mean, in the ideal world, those stories sort of that we tell, were always intended to sort of bring those young people into a place of their own reckoning, their own recognizing, their own, coming to being. And so I have to kind of continue that. I have to continue bringing those, giving those people kind of the guidance toward, embracing their being. So that's really kind of critical. So I always think, it sounds kind of like cliche now, but I do think about it. I have to think about the stories beyond me. Beyond this moment. I have to think about how they will live, for the next generations. And this was taught to me a long time ago when I started making documentaries. I remember Eva Cardinal said to me in the learning path, she said, these stories don't belong to you. She said, they belong to, our grandchildren and our great grandchildren. She says, and, one day in many generations from now, they'll be able to say that, oh, that lady's family, told by, great. So, that there's that kind of connection that goes on forever, which is hard. It's hard in this industry because this industry is all about the moment, the next big thing, the flashy thing, everybody's sort of like whoever's being, held up as the, rather than the story and the value of that story beyond, this moment. And so I think about that a lot. I think about, what is my role? And yet at the same time, I have to think about, well, where is my artistry in that? How do I let, the kind of the urgency of my own, artistic expression? How do I let these sort of, I've been at this for a long time, as you know, Cameron, and like I say, I've had, I was ahead of a curve, I guess, and so there wasn't it's not been easy. It's not easy for any filmmaker, particularly in Canada, but it's been not been easy. But at the same time, I've always had to think about, well, what is this beyond me, and even as I'm thinking of, me as filmmaker, me as storyteller, me as artist, and so it kind of creates an interesting dynamic. It's something actually, I'm part of this. I created this IM4 lab, which is this Indigenous XR lab, which is sort of something I'm also involved in these days. And I was lucky enough to be invited to this ISO, the Indigenous Screen Office, an MIT inaugural Indigenous delegation to MIT, to the co-creation lab. And we were lucky enough to have Duke Redbird be the kind of do the keynote to the opening of this, which would have been in person, but was online event. And he says, is it wise? He asked that question of science and technology. Is it wise? Mm. So, I think we have to ask that of stories as well. Is it wise? Maybe it's wise to create something that's horrific and painful because it's going to help pay your bills and support your family. Well, what does it mean in terms of that little girl, that little boy, in terms of their own sense of their being and who they are? So I have to ask myself, is it wise? So that's one thing for sure.
Well, it goes back to that idea of being in service, like in service to the stories that you're telling, although you are also an artist who's bringing something original in terms of your creativity, but there is a sense of service to the story and its characters, and also it's the future generations that are going to take that story in as well.
Yeah, it's a kind of endless loop, if you like. I also like to think that what I do is I draw upon the oral tradition, and I'm not trying to replicate it. And I talked to Jesse Wednesday about this recently in an interview. I said, I'm not, we're not replicating. I learned this a long time ago too, but Indigenous filmmakers, some who came from their very much like Victor Imanistaisiwa, who grew up in his village, and is very much a person of his traditions and the responsibilities that go with those traditions. And so he always said this idea that we're not replicating their oral tradition, but we're drawing on the tools of the oral tradition. And what are those tools? And to me, those tools are sort of like, it's the sort of the central beauty of a moment of, we embedded our stories with song and dance and visual and art. And so to me, that's another thing what I do with my filmmaking is I try to draw as much. I went to film school. I studied Fassbinder. I studied all the greats. I studied film theory. I used to do that, right?
I know
I was a sort of theoretical person for a while. Now I'm trying to be plain spoken. That was a choice I made a while ago. So, so I know all that stuff. I know all the theoretical stuff, film theory, and so on. But at some point, it was like, to me, it's critical for me to draw upon, Indigenous storytelling techniques and traditions and pedagogy and so on, and the oral tradition sort of is that basis, and I only know a fraction of it because there's many more spiritual levels to it that require almost like becoming like a what's the word, like a I'm like an apprentice in that that respect, but when the fact that the word is brought out into this realm of rich art, that art and science and art and storytelling and all those things are intertwined. That was really critical for me. And I'd like to think I kind of had a chance. I like to think I do it in Coyote Science and everything I do, but in Monkey Beach, it was sort of my chance to be able to do it. So almost fully, like I really feel like I fully embraced that idea of drawing more on Indigenous oral tradition as far as what drove the underpinnings of the aesthetic, as opposed to just Western, filmmaking aesthetic and filmmaking tropes. And sometimes I'll even do it deliberately to, maybe to my detriment. I'll say, okay, that's the way that's the Western trope. What's my, how can I counteract that? Or how can I deconstruct that? Or how can I, make that still be beautiful, still draw you into the story, still draw you into the moment, and yet not rely on those Western tropes that are signifiers of pain or suffering or happiness or joy, all those things that kind of go into telling the story and the emotional landscape of that story.
The result is beautiful. Monkey Beach really is, it's pure poetry. Loretta, thanks so much for taking the time to have this conversation. Tell us a little bit more about the film, where it comes from and how you made it. It's on Crave. Anyone across Canada can find it on Crave, and I encourage everyone to watch the film. It is the new film by Loretta Todd. I'm really glad that it is out there for audiences now. And Loretta, again, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Hi, thank you. And thank you for all the amazing work you've done all these years for filmmakers, obviously Canadian filmmakers, but just filmmaking world. And I'm so excited and so happy for your success. I mean, we were kind of kids when we started out together.
We were kids, yes. Thanks again.